Shall we bow our heads for prayer? Father in heaven, thank you once again for bringing us together. We thank you for your word. It would be a terrible thing to live in this world without any guidance as to where everything is going. We ask, Father, that as we study the events that transpired between the year 1864 and the 1890s, that your Holy Spirit will be with us and show us what can happen if the circumstances are right. We ask, Father, that you will help us to realize that we're living in the last moments of time. And we thank you, Father, for being with us and for answering our prayer, for we ask it in the precious name of Jesus. Amen. In our last study together, we noticed the prophetic dimension of Matthew chapter 24. We dedicated a significant amount of time to study the abomination of desolation in prophecy. And we noticed that there was a definite connection between the eagles of Rome and the eagle which was adopted for the state of arms of the United States of America. We also noted that according to Bible prophecy, eventually, someday, we believe soon, there is going to be in the United States a national Sunday law mandating the observance of Sunday as the day of rest. And this will be the abomination spoken of in prophecy, which eventually will lead to desolation. Another way of expressing it is that national apostasy will lead to national ruin. Now, many of those who are here today probably are saying, this could never happen in the United States of America. This is the land of the free and the home of the brave. This is the land that has the greatest constitution in the history of the world. We are the people of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The fact is, folks, that we don't have to speculate about whether this can happen or not, because in the 1880s, we have an experience in the history of the United States where something like this almost transpired. And that's what we want to study about today. We want to go back to 1864, and we want to study through the end of the 19th century to see how these events transpired in our history. And in this way, we're going to see that this is not only possible, but it becomes very probable. Now, in order to prepare for what we're going to study today, we need to remember that there were two sieges of the city of Jerusalem. There was the first siege by Cestius Gallus. He surrounded the city in the year 66. The Romans placed their standards in the ground, and they worshiped them. But for some unexplainable reason, we know it was divine providence, Cestius Gallus withdrew. And the Jews followed the Roman armies, and there were many casualties among the Romans when they suddenly left Jerusalem. Of course, Christians who were in the city saw that as the sign that they were supposed to flee. And so the Christians in the city, those who were attached to the Lord Jesus Christ, left. A while later, Titus, the new general of the Roman armies, returned to the city of Jerusalem and surrounded it once again. And this time, there was no withdrawal. The destruction of the city of Jerusalem came. I believe that the same thing is going to transpire in the United States of America. I believe that what happened in 1888 would be parallel to the first siege of Jerusalem. It was a sign to God's people that this was going to eventually take place in the United States, and that we should prepare for momentous events that are going to take place in the future. Now, I'd like to give you a few of the sources that I've used in preparing the material for our study today. And I'll go through this quickly. There are some sources from the writings of Ellen White. She lived during this period. She actually wrote the great controversy during this period. So we would need to read from her writings, especially the chapter titled The Impending Conflict in the book, The Great Controversy. Also, volume 5 of the Testimonies, pages 711 through 718. Besides this, there are some other sources. We have the book Civil Government and Religion by A.T. Jones, who had to go and testify before the Education Committee of the United States Senate. Also, a book of essays written by A.T. Jones and Pastor Wagoner. The title of that book is Views of National Reform. And then finally, the last source I would like to mention is the book National Sunday Law, written by A.T. Jones. Actually, it's a transcript of his testimony before Congress, appealing to Congress to not impose this Sunday law which was being proposed. Incidentally, A.T. Jones says in his book that Senator Blair, who was the one who was pushing for this national Sunday law, interrupted him many, many times during the period in which he was giving his speech. Now, what I want to do is I want to speak about what transpired back then. And for this, I'm going to have to read several statements. I hope that you don't get bored listening to all these statements, but I feel that I need to read what the religious leaders of that day were actually saying about the proposed amendment to the Constitution of the United States. However, before I read these quotations, I need to tell you something about the National Reform Movement. This organization was established in the year 1864. And the avowed purpose was to amend the Constitution so that the Constitution would say that the United States is a Christian nation. Also, it was the purpose of the National Reform Organization to have Congress write a national Sunday law and impose it by law upon the citizens of the United States. The first National Reform Convention was held in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, January 27 and 28 of the year 1864. According to the sources, there were 120 vice presidents of this organization. It kind of makes me remember the 120 satraps in Daniel chapter 6 that ended up throwing Daniel in the lion's den. By the way, they had a publication, the National Reform Movement had a publication called The Christian Statesman. And this is a very, very interesting publication because it tells what their objectives were and what their methods were as well. The Christian Statesman for December 24, 1885, said this about those who composed the National Reform Movement in that year. It stated that there were 15 college professors, 16 college presidents, 3 ex-governors, 7 justices of Supreme Courts, 5 judges of Superior Courts, 2 judges of the United States District Court, 1 judge of the United States Circuit Court, with many, many others who you would address as your honors, reverends, and doctors of divinity. Now, the National Sunday Law was actually proposed as a bill to the Senate of the United States by Senator Henry W. Blair of New Hampshire. It was Bill number 2983. And the idea was to write a national Sunday law that would be imposed upon the citizens of the United States. In our next lecture, we're going to notice that something else was happening in 1888. There was a famous Congress of the Seventh-day Adventist Church being held in the city of Minneapolis. This is not a coincidence, as we're going to study in our next lecture. While God was trying to draw His people together, Satan was working to draw his people together. In other words, the battle lines were being drawn in that very year, the year 1888. By the way, going beyond a little beyond 1888, in 1889, the National Catholic Congress, which met in Baltimore, resolved officially to unite with Protestants to secure proper Sunday observance. In the year 1892, the United States Supreme Court declared that the United States is a Christian nation. Allow me to say that I don't believe the United States is a Christian nation. I believe that the United States is a nation composed mostly of Christians. It's very different to say that it's a Christian nation than to say that it's a nation composed mostly of Christians. It is a nation that is based on divine principles. The principle that we need to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and unto God that which is God's. Upon the idea of full civil and religious liberty. Upon the idea of the separation of church and state. These are Christian principles upon which the nation is built. However, the nation is not as such a Christian nation. Finally, this proposal of a national Sunday law led A.T. Jones to be sent by the Seventh-day Adventist denomination to testify before the Education and Labor Committee of the 50th United States Congress. This happened on December 13, 1888. And I believe that the arguments that were presented by A.T. Jones were so persuasive and so powerful that the National Sunday Law was placed on hold. Now let's examine a few things that the national reformers were saying as we move from 1864 to the 1890s. First of all, it's important to notice that Catholics were behind this religious amendment, this amendment to make the United States a Christian nation, and this amendment to have a national Sunday law. In an encyclical letter in 1885, Pope Leo XIII said this: all Catholics should do all in their power to cause the constitutions of states and legislation to be molded on the principles of the true church. And all Catholic writers and journalists should never lose sight for an instant from the view of the above prescription. Also, the famous Henry Cardinal Gibbons had this to say: I am most happy to add my name to those of the millions of others who are laudably contending against the violation of the Christian Sabbath by unnecessary labor, and who are endeavoring to promote its decent and proper observance by judicious legislation. So Gibbons is saying, add my name to the list of those who want a national Sunday law. Something very interesting that was taking place during this period is that the ministers that belonged to the National Reform movement actually wanted to join church and state. They wanted to amend the Constitution to make this possible. For example, Jonathan Edwards, at the New York City Convention, which was held on February 26 and 27 of 1873, said this about what the ministers and the churches wanted. We want state and religion, and we are going to have it. The Christian oath and Christian morality shall have in this land an undeniable legal basis. We use this word religion in its proper sense as meaning a man's personal relation of faith and obedience to God. So what he's saying is that state and religion need to be placed on an undeniable legal basis. By the way, the word legal means by law. Notice what Reverend M.A. Galt had to say, another one of the great leaders of this movement. He says, speaking about all of the malefic influences in society, like the problems with liquor and immorality and materialism and the problems with the Civil War, he said this: our remedy for all these malefic influences is to have the government simply set up the moral law and recognize God's authority behind it and lay its hand on any religion that does not conform to it. Dr. Mandeville, who was another one of the great leaders of this movement, said this: when the Church of God awakes and does its duty on one side and the state on the other, we shall have no further trouble in this matter of the desecration of Sunday which is what he's talking about. Sam Small, who was secretary of the National Prohibition Convention held in Indianapolis in the year 1888, preached a sermon in Kansas City in January of 1888 where he said this: "I want to see the day come when the church shall be arbiter of all legislation." Are you catching that? He wants to see the day when the church shall be the arbiter of all legislation, state, national, and municipal, when the great churches of the country can come together harmoniously. Notice, when the churches of the country can come together harmoniously and issue their edict, and the legislative powers will respect it and enact it into laws. Not much camouflage there, is there, about what their motivations were. Regarding the duties of the state, Reverend J.M. Foster said this: that a constitutional provision be made for recognizing God as King of nations, that a constitutional recognition be made that the state is the divinely appointed keeper of the moral law, that a constitutional provision be made detailing the moral and religious qualifications of those who would occupy an office of trust, that the nation needed to make a covenant with God, and that the nation must guard and protect the church by suppressing all public violation of the moral law, by maintaining a system of public schools, indoctrinating their youth in morality and virtue, by exempting church property from taxation, and providing her funds of the public treasury for carrying on her aggressive work at home and in the foreign field. Notice what they wanted the government to do, what the church should do. They wanted the state to perform. At the Cleveland National Convention, we find this resolution which was adopted: resolved, that we reaffirm that this religious amendment, instead of infringing on any individual's right of conscience or tending in the least degree to a union of church and state, will afford the fullest security against a corrupting church establishment and form the strongest safeguard of both the civil and religious liberties of all citizens. Now, one is left to ask, how would this be possible if you're declaring the United States to be a Christian nation, and if by law you're obligating everyone to keep the first day of the week as a day of rest? Dr. McAllister, another one of the leaders of this movement, in Lakeside, Ohio, in July of 1887, had this to say: "Let a man be what he may, Jew, Seventh-day Observer, or some other denomination, or those who do not believe in the Christian Sabbath, let the law apply to everyone, that there shall be no public desecration of the first day of the week, the Christian Sabbath, the day of rest for the nation. They may hold any other day of the week as sacred and observe it, but that day, which is the one day in 7 for the nation at large, let that not be publicly desecrated by anyone, by officer in the government, or by proper citizen, high or low, rich or poor." Do you notice that a couple of times in this statement he speaks about the day of rest for the nation at large? This, in other words, was a proposal of a national Sunday law by the churches, and the state was supposed to rewrite the Constitution and mandate the observance of this day as the day of rest. In the Elgin Sunday Law Convention, Dr. Mandeville of Chicago used the example of Nehemiah in the Old Testament to say what the state should do. These are his words: "The merchants of Tyre insisted upon selling goods near the temple on the Sabbath, and Nehemiah compelled the officers of the law to do their duty and stop it. So we can compel the officers of the law to do their duty." Does that sound like the voice of the dragon? And this is not happening in this day and age. This was happening back in the 1870s and 1880s. Notice that the National Sunday Law mass meeting held in Hamilton Hall in Oakland, California, in fact, January of 1887, Dr. Briggs of Napa, California, spanked the political leaders for not imposing a national Sunday law as a day of rest. He said to them, "You relegate moral instruction to the church, and then let all go as they please on Sunday so that we cannot get at them." In other words, you let them go shopping and ride the train and read the newspapers, as we're going to notice in a few moments, on Sunday, and that way people don't come to church and we don't have access to them. So he's saying, you political leaders need to give a national Sunday law so that the people are forced to come to church so that we have access to them so that we can then moralize them, so to speak. In other words, they wanted the state to corral all of the people and bring them to church by force on Sunday so that they would have access to them. Since when is it the role of the state to get people to go to church so that the pastors can preach sermons to them and moralize them, so to speak? Now, why did they want this national Sunday law? Well, actually, the reason why is because they saw society falling apart. They saw an increase in crime. By the way, this was in the aftermath of the Civil War. There were tremendous societal problems. There was problem with liquor at that time, so the prohibitionists arose. And so they said, in order for the United States to correct these problems, everybody needs to get back to church. And in order to get back to church, there has to be a national Sunday law. In fact, I want you to notice what Dr. Briggs had to say about the Sunday newspaper. He said this: "What a melange. What a dish to set down before a man before breakfast and after breakfast." He's talking about the newspaper. He says, what a melange, what a dish to set down before a man before breakfast and after breakfast, to prepare him for hearing the word of God. It makes it twice as hard to reach those who go to the sanctuary and keeps away from the house many from worship altogether. They read the paper, the time comes to go to church, but it is said, here is something interesting, I will read it and not go to church today. Another one of the leaders said this: the laboring class are apt to rise late on Sunday morning, read the Sunday papers, and allow the hour of worship to go by unheeded. And so the idea is eliminate the Sunday newspaper so people can't sit down to read it at breakfast, and therefore they decide to go to church. At the Elgin Convention, Dr. Everts, who is one of the better-known personalities of the movement, said this about the Sunday train. You see, they wanted to eliminate the Sunday train also. This is what he said: the Sunday train is another great evil. They cannot afford to run a train unless they get a great many passengers, and so break up a great many congregations. The Sunday railroad trains are hurrying their passengers fast on to perdition. What an outrage that the railroad, that great civilizer, should destroy the Christian Sabbath. By the way, that name for the day of rest, Christian Sabbath, is definitely a misnomer, because there's nothing Christian about the first day of the week. It is a pagan day all the way back, as we've studied, to ancient Babylon. The Reverend M.A. Galt of the National Reform Association published an article in the Christian Statesman of September 25, 1884, where he said this about the railroad. The railroad, he's talking about the Chicago and Rock Island Railroad, has been running excursion trains from Des Moines to Colfax Springs on the Sabbath for some time. And the ministers complain that their members go on these excursions. So, of course, you need a national Sunday law to shut down the trains, to get rid of the newspapers on the first day of the week, and that way people don't have anything to do other than go to church and listen to the sermon by the pastor. In the Boston Monday Lectures, Dr. Joseph Cook, this was in the year 1887, clearly said that the ministers did not want a civil Sabbath. They did not want just a secular day of rest. They wanted a religious day of rest. Notice his words. The experience of centuries shows, however, that you will in vain endeavor to preserve Sunday as a day of rest unless you preserve it as a day of worship. Unless Sabbath, and by the way, when he says Sabbath, he's meaning Sunday, unless Sabbath observance be founded upon religious reasons, you will not long maintain it at a high standard on the basis of economic, physiological, and political considerations only. It's interesting that they saw that anyone who was opposed to this idea of mandating Sunday as the day of rest would be considered unpatriotic. Notice the resolution of the Elgin Convention. The argument is that the first day of the week belongs to natural law, biblical law, civil law, and is American besides. This is what this resolution said. Resolved, that we recognize the Sabbath as an institution of God. He means Sunday, by the way. Revealed in nature and the Bible. By the way, it's not revealed in nature or the Bible. And of perpetual obligation on all men. We believe that the Sabbath is of perpetual obligation upon all men. And he continues saying, the convention continues saying, and also as a civil and American institution, bound up in vital and historical connection with the origin and foundation of our government, the growth of our polity, and necessary to be maintained, notice this, in order for the preservation and integrity of our national system, and therefore as having a sacred claim on all patriotic American citizens. So the Sunday was considered to be American. Anybody against it was not considered to be patriotic. And it's interesting that he says that this institution was in harmony with natural law, biblical law, civil law, and of course the history of blue laws in the United States. Also, we noticed at the Elgin Convention that they were opposed to purchasing, business, and travel on the first day of the week. This is what one of the ministers said, that we look with shame and sorrow on the non-observance of the Sabbath by many Christian people, in that the custom prevails with them of purchasing Sabbath newspapers, engaging in and patronizing Sabbath business and travel, and in many instances giving themselves to pleasure and self-indulgence, setting aside by neglect and indifference the great duties and privileges which God's day brings them. Now, there was also, as I mentioned, the idea that the United States was a Christian nation. They actually wanted to amend the Constitution so that the Constitution would say that the United States was a Christian nation. Notice, for example, one of the leaders who said this, "Give all men to understand that this is a Christian nation, and that believing," now notice this, "and that believing that without Christianity we perish, we must maintain by all right means our Christian character. Inscribe this character on our Constitution. Enforce upon all that come among us the laws of Christian morality." And also in the Statesman, the publication, you find this. What the Statesman designates as political atheism, that is, political leaders who don't agree with the National Sunday Law, is nothing more nor less than the present form of government and the present Constitution of the United States. They're saying that the Constitution, as it was written, was political atheism. Today it would be called secular humanism, by the way. The statement continues saying, "To impose national reform is to them," that is to the national reformers, "sheer atheism. And to oppose the kind of government which they endorse is political atheism. That no religious test shall be required of a civil ruler is declared by Reverend M.A. Galt to be the infidel theory of government. Something else that the leaders were doing is that they were kind of doing a type of voter guide, kind of telling their church members who they should vote for and who they shouldn't. Does this kind of ring a bell? Notice the third resolution of the Elgin Convention that speaks about the need to vote for certain candidates. Resolved that we give our votes and support to those candidates or political officers who will pledge themselves to vote for the enactment and enforcing of statutes in favor of the civil Sabbath. And the Honorable John Cole of Tingley, Iowa, in the Christian Statesman, September 16, 1886, said this: if Congress does not find in our Constitution a basis for Sabbath legislation, then let us elect a Congress who will find such a basis. They were also promoting having rallies in Washington, D.C. as the amendment was being considered to put the pressure on the legislators to enact the National Sunday Law. Notice this, for example. Let us begin without delay the circulation of petitions to be furnished in proper form by the association, by the National Reform Association. And let an opportunity be given to all parts of the country to make up a roll of petitions so great that it will require a procession of wheelbarrows to trundle the mighty mass into the presence of the representatives of the nation in the houses of Congress. Let a mass convention of the friends of the cause be held in Washington when the Blair resolution shall be under discussion, to accompany with its influence the presentation of the petitions, and to take such other action as may be deemed best to arouse the nation to a genuine enthusiasm in behalf of our national Christianity. Notice also what the Reverend J.C.K. Milligan said in the Christian Statesman, July 26, 1888, about the idea of electing individuals that would be in favor of the National Sunday Law. He said this: by letters to senators and representatives in Congress, by petitions numerously signed and forwarded to them, by local, state, and national conventions held, and public meetings in every school district. It's interesting that they have the school districts involved. Such an influence, he continues, can quickly be brought to bear as will compel our legislators to adopt the measure and enforce it by the needed legislation. The Christian pulpits, if they would, could secure its adoption before the dog days end. In another statement, we find this: the changes will come gradually and probably only after the whole framework of Bible legislation has been thoroughly canvassed by Congress and state legislatures, by the Supreme Court of the United States and of the several states, and by lawyers and citizens. An outpouring of the Spirit might soon secure it. In other words, they're talking about taking over all of the branches of government to secure this National Sunday Law. By the way, back then, the party that was pushing for this were the Democrats, not the Republicans. Notice this interesting piece of an article written in the Lansing Republican from back then. They're criticizing this idea. Thousands of men, speaking about those who vote for certain candidates and the candidates giving in because of political pressure, thousands of men, if called upon to vote for such an amendment, would hesitate to vote against God, although they might not believe that the amendment is necessary or that it is right. Such an amendment would be likely to receive an affirmative vote, which would by no means indicate the true sentiment of the people. Men who make politics a trade would hesitate to record their names against the proposed constitutional amendment advocated by the great religious denominations of the land. Today we'd call them religious conservatives, by the way. And endorsed by such men as Bishop Simpson, Bishop McIlvaine, Bishop Eastburn, President Finney, Professor Lewis, Professor Cillier, Bishop Huntington, Bishop Kerfoot, Dr. Patterson, Dr. Coiler, and many other divines who are the representative men of their respective denominations. They also spoke about uniting all of the Protestant denominations. Notice this interesting statement in the publication Christian Statesman, February 7, 1884. We are different divisions of Emmanuel's army. The Methodists are the charging cavalry, the Presbyterians the fighting infantry, the Covenanters the batteries upon the heights. We have one commander-in-chief, and under him we go forward, one united phalanx against the common enemy, and when the victory is gained, the army will be one and the leader one. Notice the idea of uniting in this common cause. Notice what Reverend Milligan had to say about the pastors being the moral conscience of the nation. He said this: the churches and the pulpits have much to do with the shaping and forming opinions on all moral questions, and with interpretations of Scripture on moral and civil, as well as on theological and ecclesiastical points. And it is probable that in the most universal gathering of our citizens about these, the chief discussions and the final decision of most points will be developed there. In other words, the ministers are actually going to be the ones who are going to write and formulate theologically what this law would say. And then I want you to notice the text that is used. Many nations shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For the law shall go forth of Zion. There is certainly, now notice this, there certainly is no class of citizens more intelligent, patriotic, and trustworthy than the leaders and teachers in our churches. Isn't that interesting that they would have the ministers be the driving force behind the politicians to redact or write this Sunday law and have it imposed upon the people? Another interesting thing that they were doing is they were playing games with the Establishment Clause. In fact, they were saying that the Establishment Clause simply forbids the government from establishing a church, a national church, but it does not forbid the government from establishing religion. Notice that at the Pittsburgh Convention, which was held in 1874, Professor Blanchard had this to say: but union of church and state is the selection by the nation of one church, the endorsement of such a church, the appointment of its officers, and oversight of its doctrines. For such a union, none of us plead. To such a union, we are all of us opposed. In other words, we're opposed, according to him, to the idea that the government should select our leaders and should dictate what happens in the church. But that doesn't mean that the government cannot establish religion in general terms for everyone. W.J. Coleman had this to say about the Establishment Clause. The first sentence of Article 1 of Amendments reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now he explains what that means. This would be made consistent with the proposed amendment by substituting the words a church for religion, making it read, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a church. In other words, they wanted to amend the First Amendment to say that Congress cannot establish a church, not necessarily religion. Then he says this is what the Reform Association believes should be the rule in a rightly constituted state. There should be religion, but no church. There was also an embracing of Roman Catholics by Protestants. Notice in the Christian Statesman, December 11, 1884, this: we cordially, gladly recognize the fact that in South American republics and in France and other European countries, The Roman Catholics are the recognized advocates of national Christianity and stand opposed to all the proposals of secularism. In other words, they're saying the Catholic Church is just like us. They're opposing secularism by establishing national religion, not a national religion, but establishing religious observances. And they said, this is exactly what we want here. Have you ever heard of the image to the beast in Revelation chapter 13? That's exactly what Revelation 13 is talking about. Now, I want you to notice another statement, and there's a very significant couple of words here. This is Christian Statesman, December 11, 1884. Whenever the Roman Catholics are willing to cooperate in resisting the progress of political atheism, you understand what that means, political atheism, right? That means that government does not become involved in religion at all. Whenever they, that is Roman Catholics, are willing to cooperate in resisting the progress of political atheism, we will gladly join hands. I want you to remember that. We will gladly join hands with them. Sylvester F. Scoville said this about the cooperation between Protestants and Roman Catholics. He says, this common interest ought both to strengthen our determination to work and our readiness to cooperate in every way with our Roman Catholic fellow citizens. We may be subjected to some rebuffs in our first proffers, and the time has not yet come when the Roman Church will consent to strike hands with other churches as such. But the time has come to make repeated advances and gladly to accept cooperation in any form in which they may be willing to exhibit it. It is one of the necessities of the situation. This is not a case of Catholics seeking the cooperation of Protestants. This is a case of Protestants seeking the cooperation of Roman Catholics. There was also talk of establishing religious instruction in public schools. Notice Senator Blair, what Senator Blair had to say about religious textbooks. He said, I believe that a textbook of instruction in the principles of virtue, morality, and of the Christian religion can be prepared for use in the public schools by the joint efforts of those who represent every branch of the Christian church, both Protestant and Catholic, and also those who are not actively associated with either. Another interesting aspect is that this bad cause of trying to get a national Sunday law passed was linked with other good causes. Like, for example, the need to overcome alcoholism. It's known as prohibition. In fact, Sam Jones, a third-party prohibitionist, in July of 1888, in a talk that he gave in Windsor, Canada, which was composed mostly of Americans there, had this to say, now I tell you, I think we are running the last political combat on the lines we have been running them on. It is between the Republicans and the Democrats, this contest. And it is the last the Republicans will make in America. The Democrats are going in overwhelmingly. 4 years from now, the prohibition element will break the solid South. The issue then will be God or no God, drunkenness or sobriety, Sunday, Sabbath or no Sabbath, heaven or hell. That will be the issue. Then we will wipe up the ground with the Democratic Party and let God rule America from that time on. Does that sound like the voice of the dragon? This is in the 1880s, not in 2007. The Women's Christian Temperance Union of that time was pushing for prohibition, but they were also very strong supporters of the National Sunday Law. Actually, what they wanted was a theocracy, like in colonial times. Notice this. A true theocracy is yet to come, and the enthronement of Christ in law and lawmakers. Hence, I pray devoutly, as a Christian patriot, for the ballot in the hands of women, and rejoice that the National Women's Christian Temperance Union has so long championed this cause. So they're longing for the day that women can vote, so that they can vote not only for prohibition, but also for a national Sunday law. Most of the leaders of this movement actually wanted a theocracy in the United States. A theocracy means that the civil government would be ruled by the wishes of the church. Allow me to read you some statements where they express this view overtly. Professor Blanchard at the Elgin Convention spoke about the role of ministers in this so-called new theocracy. He said, "In this work we are undertaking for the Sabbath, we are the representatives of God." He says the ministers are the representatives of God. Here's another statement. The government of Israel was a theocracy. The will of God was made known to the ruler by the prophets. The ruler compelled the officers of the law to prevent the ungodly from selling goods on the Sabbath. This government is to be made a theocracy. He's saying in his day and age, this government is to be made a theocracy. The preachers are the successors of the prophets, and they are to compel the officers of the law to prevent all selling of goods and all manner of work on Sunday. Dr. Crafts, General Secretary of the National Sunday Law Union, said this: the preachers are the successors of the prophets. The President's annual address at the convention held in Nashville in 1887 had this to say: the Women's Christian Temperance Union, local, state, national, and worldwide, has one vital organic thought, one all-absorbing purpose, one undying enthusiasm, and that is that Christ shall be this world's king. Kind of sounds like the Mount of Temptation, doesn't it? Yea, verily, this world's king. And that's in capital letters. In its realm of cause and effects, king of its courts, its camps, its commerce, king of its colleges and cloisters, king of its customs and its constitutions. The kingdom of Christ must enter the realm of law through the gateway of politics. Interesting. The kingdom of Christ must enter the realm of law through the gateway of politics. We pray heaven to give the old parties no rest until they shall swear an oath of allegiance to Christ in politics and march in one great army up to the polls to worship God. In fact, they spoke about disenfranchising people who did not agree with them. In other words, people would lose their citizenship. Notice what E.B. Graham of the National Reform Convention of York, Nebraska had to say. We might add, in all justice, if opponents of the Bible do not like our government and its Christian features, let them go to some wild, desolate land, and in the name of the devil and for the sake of the devil, subdue it and set up a government of their own on infidel and atheistic ideas, and then, if they can stand it, stay there until they die. John Calvin Knox Milligan, another minister that was in favor of this movement, said this: when the amendment is adopted, and by the way, he was thinking it was going to be adopted in 1888, but we know that it's going to be adopted in the future. When the amendment is adopted, how will it act upon the civil and political rights of infidels, Jews, etc.? He asked. What effect will it have on them? He says, this depends largely upon themselves. The worst result will be to disenfranchise them. M.A. Galt, District Secretary of the Association, said this: a remedy for all these malefic influences, the turmoil in society he's talking about, is to have the government simply set up the moral law and recognize God's authority behind it and lay its hand on any religion that does not conform to it. Christian Statesman, October 2, 1884, give all men to understand that this is a Christian nation, and that, believing that without Christianity we perish, those are the words of Caiaphas, by the way, in John chapter 11, we must maintain by all means our Christian character, inscribe this character on our Constitution, enforce upon all who come among us the laws of Christian morality. Well, what eventually would come as a result of this? The result would be persecution against those who did not agree. Notice at the National Reform Women's Christians Temperance Union Convention, which was held at Lakeside, Ohio in 1887, notice these words. There is a law in the state of Arkansas enforcing Sunday observance upon the people. And the result has been that many good persons have not only been imprisoned, but have lost their property and even their lives. This was back in 1888. Now, this was an objection by someone that belonged to the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Notice the answer of Dr. McAllister, one of the leaders of the movement. He says, and these words are prophetic, "It is better that a few should suffer." Know where that comes from? John 11. "It is better that a few should suffer than that the whole nation should lose its Sabbath." By the way, those words of Caiaphas were fulfilled by their rejection of Christ. The nation was taken away, and the nation was destroyed. In the year 556, Pope Pelagius called upon an individual called Narcissus to command people to obey the Pope's commands by force of law. Narcissus, complained to the Pope. He says, we shouldn't have to use force to compel people to do what the Pope says. Notice what Pelagius wrote back to him. "Be not alarmed at the idle talk of some, crying out against persecution and reproaching the church as if she delighted in cruelty. When she punishes evil with wholesome severities or procures the salvation of souls." And now notice this. "He alone persecutes who forces to do evil." Is that true? Persecution is only when you persecute evil? He says, notice, "He alone persecutes who forces to do evil. But to restrain men from doing evil or to punish those who have done it is not persecution or cruelty, but love of mankind." In other words, to persecute error is not persecution. That's incredible. But it's not so incredible, because even in colonial times, have you ever heard of John Cotton? He was one of the prominent religious leaders in colonial times, and this is what he had to say. "Persecution is not wrong in itself. It is wicked for falsehood to persecute truth, but it is the sacred duty of truth to persecute falsehood." And that's exactly what happened in colonial times. The question is Sunday falsehood? But those who were teaching were saying it was the truth. That's why you have to have freedom of conscience, to worship God according to the dictates of your own conscience, and not as people perceive the truth. Interestingly enough, there was a Virginia Sunday law which was enacted in 1610, which required attendance at the divine service twice a day, with economic fines for the first two offenses and to suffer death for the third. This is in colonial America. First two times you missed the Sunday service, economic fines. The third time you missed, the sentence was to suffer death. A minister in Selma, California, interestingly enough, right around the corner, September of 1888, had this to say: "We have laws to punish the man who steals our property, but we have no law to prevent people from working on Sunday. It is right that the thief be punished, but I have more sympathy for that man than I have for him that works on that day." Do you know that in Arkansas and in Tennessee, Seventh-day Adventists were persecuted for not observing Sunday as the day of rest? Property was confiscated. They were fined, they were imprisoned, and some of them even lost their lives. In fact, A.T. Jones, in the book Civil Government and Religion, documents 21 cases with names of the accused, places, names of judges, charges, and penalties that were enacted as a result of people who simply wanted to follow the dictates of their conscience and keep the Sabbath as the day of rest. And you don't think that that can happen again in the United States? Most of the Sunday laws, most of the blue laws, have never been taken off the books. They're there. They're latent, just waiting to be enacted. Finally, I would like to read from the Century, which is a publication for April 1888. A Mr. Keenan described the statutes of Russia on the subject of crimes against the faith. What he's going to say is that the United States at that day and age was very similar to Russia. Notice, he says this. He quoted a statute after statute, and I quote, providing that whoever shall censure the Christian faith or the Orthodox Church or the Scriptures or the Holy Sacraments or the saints or their images or the Virgin Mary or the angels or Christ or God shall be deprived of all civil rights and exiled for life to the most remote parts of Siberia. This is the system in Russia, he says, and it is in the direct line of the wishes of the National Reform Association. With this difference, however, that Russia is content to send dissenters to Siberia, while the National Reformers want to send them to the devil straight. One final statement from the Christian Statement, August 8, 1888. Every sin, secret or public, against God is a sin against our country and is high treason against the state. Did you know all of this was happening around that time? Probably most of us didn't. Can something like this happen again in the United States of America? Not only can it happen, but according to what we studied, it will happen again. So we must be certain that we are keeping God's true day of rest.